Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher at the IOG. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Eyck Freymann. He's a visiting research fellow with the Institute of Geoeconomics, a Hoover Fellow at Stanford, and he's the author, most recently, of Defending Taiwan, a Strategy to Prevent War with China by Oxford University Press. Eyck, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Paul.
Certainly. So, in keeping with the remit of the podcast, I want to try to focus as much as possible on the economic dimensions, the geoeconomic dimensions of all of this. But for our listeners, I want to emphasize that there's way more to this book beyond just economics. It covers security, politics. So I strongly encourage everyone to pick up a copy. But we ourselves today are going to talk about the economic dimensions of a possible crisis over the Taiwan Strait. So first things first, what's at stake for the world in a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, economically speaking?
Well, the first thing to understand is that Taiwan produces 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors, and a greater proportion, some say 99%, of the truly cutting-edge NVIDIA GPUs that are training the next generation of AI models. So just to start, there's the question of what happens to the global financial system if the supply of chips coming out of Taiwan comes under question. Let's set aside the real economy for a minute and just talk about the stock market. In the United States, we now have 7 companies making up more than 40% of the S&P 500. Those 7 companies have something in common. Their valuations are ludicrously stretched, forecasting future profits coming from AI. AI that has not been invented yet, that will be supposedly trained on future chips. And the second thing they have in common is they're all customers of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. So that's the first thing that could happen. And it could happen even before China shoots missiles at Taiwan, tries to decapitate its leaders, before there's a blockade or anything else. It just takes a market shift from pricing the risk from being zero to being non-zero. And this could be one of those moments where the stock market falls 10, 20, or more % in a day. That's the sort of thing that could get people's attention. It affects people's 401ks, their retirement savings, and also potentially financial stability. And that is even setting aside the effect on supply chains, automobiles, electronics, other essential industries like medical devices, and then this entirely different second-order effect of what would happen if U.S.-China trade were disrupted as a result.
So is that inevitable, though? Is there a scenario where, short of missiles being fired, you have, as you described, potentially a quarantine, where China doesn't necessarily invade, but they sort of take over administrative control of Taiwan's borders? If that were to maintain the flow of semiconductors out of TSMC, are we still at risk? Is this scenario inevitable?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's inevitable because I think China can be deterred. It has been deterred so far, and I think with skillful and steady American leadership, leveraging allied power, the status quo can hold, and Xi Jinping can be persuaded. The dream lives on, and patience is the surest way to achieve it. But you're asking, is there a way that China makes a move to take Taiwan in which these supply chains are not disrupted? And the answer is yes. And let me give you the most obvious manifestation of this scenario. China starts to squeeze Taiwan, or they're already squeezing them, squeeze them a little further, and Taiwan capitulates. They give up. Probably not under this administration, but potentially under a different one. Taiwan might be persuaded. We have no choice but to make a deal with Beijing, a deal that could give Beijing substantial control over Taiwan's semiconductor base. That could mean even the ability to apply export controls. So just as the United States has said Taiwan's advanced chips can't be sent to China, what if China can say that Taiwan's advanced chips can't be sent to the United States? Now, but that could happen as a possibility in the future. It wouldn't necessarily happen right away. And that leads me to the second point. If we're imagining this financial market response to the disruption over Taiwan, the financial markets falling 20%, 30%, everyone panicking, CNBC, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, this is the end times. This is the end of the AI story. Whoever triggers that is the bad guy. And that's a very important political point. If China initiates hostilities, they are the bad guy, not just in the eyes of the American people, the people of Japan, but in the eyes of the whole world who are suffering the economic consequences. Therefore, I think it's much more attractive, if you're China, to engineer a scenario where the United States is the bad guy and the chips fall quietly, slowly, under your control, one little increment at a time, unless the Americans decide to cause a crisis, and then it's the decision of the American president to press that big red button on the Resolute desk, which says the financial crisis that ends my presidency.
So to illustrate how bad the bad guy would be in this scenario, there was a report from Bloomberg recently, I'm sure you've seen it, that estimates the cost of a Taiwan contingency at about $8 trillion for the global economy. It's about 8% of global GDP, bigger than the 2009 financial crisis, bigger than COVID. Does that track with your understanding? Is that what's at stake here?
So these numbers are really all made up. And I've had some friendly interactions with some of the Bloomberg economists who worked on these models and ribbed them a little bit about the assumptions. But of course, it's not quite fair of me. All models are wrong, but they're wrong in supposedly an interesting or a useful way. The assumptions that were baked into that model is that all exports in and out of Taiwan were entirely shut down, and also that there was follow-on disruption from sanctions or other policy interventions to make it difficult for China to import and export. And you can judge for yourself whether those sorts of policies could be sustained for an entire year. It's an annualized number. It's not a number that hits you all at once on day one. With that said, there's reasons to believe that this may underestimate the effect because of the financial reaction that I described. Increasingly in the age of AI, there's a real economy with supply chains and stuff in the physical world, and then there's a financial economy that's all priced for perfection because AI is going to deliver us from all of the terrible things, and these things bear relatively little to do with one another. One thing that we can say is that if there were some kind of crisis and the markets did start to price this risk, all of the world's central banks would come under enormous pressure to respond. Similarly to the beginning of the COVID pandemic, because a failure to respond in the way they did in March of 2020 would risk a cascading financial crisis that would be more like 2008 or 1929. So these are decisions that central banks would have to make very early. And those decisions, I think, would shape the following course of events.
So, let's unpack the analogies a little bit, because all analogies are problematic, of course, but I think they do help, provide certain signposts to understanding what's going on. So how would a Taiwan crisis compare to some of the other things we've seen, like the crisis over the Strait of Hormuz or Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Would we be looking at similar disruptions? Obviously we wouldn't have to worry about oil and natural gas in the same way, but what could we learn from those crises, looking back to look forward?
In terms of the impact on the world economy and the financial system, it would be much more like a COVID scale event than a Russia-Ukraine or Hormuz event. That's not to say there's not lessons we can learn, and I actually discuss both of these in the book. Not Hormuz, I discuss Russia-Ukraine in the book. But the reason why it's not equivalent to Russia-Ukraine is that Russia is around 10% of global oil supply. Actually, it's less now, but it was around 10% in 2022. And roughly 20% of global oil supply went through Hormuz. But the world has stockpiles of oil. Japan has more than 6 months of oil stockpile. The United States has at least 3 months. China has at least 3 months. Now, these numbers have been reduced since the Hormuz crisis broke out, but that means that there is a buffer. There is also, to some degree, spare capacity in other parts of the world. If 20% of the world's oil supply is going through Hormuz, that means 80% is being produced someplace else. And if everyone is able to increase their production by just 10 to 15%, they can cover half or so of the lost supply. There is no strategic stockpile of semiconductors. These things age faster than canned tuna. And they're some of the most valuable resources in the world. So as soon as they are produced, they go straight into a data center. And that means if the supply is disrupted, the impact is immediate. And the process of setting up alternative production facilities to produce not just at the quality of the chips that Taiwan is producing, but at the scale at which they are producing. This is not a 5-year, more like a 10-year project. And that's even assuming that there's not industrial sabotage happening back and forth at the same time. So if we lose access to these fabs, the entire world economy is going to enter a very, very different phase of its development, where we're looking at minimum at a global recession, but also at a fundamental reevaluation of what our technology industry, or what our auto industry, what our medical industry will be able to deliver us. And that is a bracing thing. That is a thing that will affect every American citizen, every Japanese. It will have humanitarian consequences in the developing world. And so while we can look at Hormuz and Russia-Ukraine as for some guidance, I think China can, for example, learn lessons from how Russia handled sanctions. As a world economy thinking about how we could brace for this shock, the better analogy is COVID.
So that's a good jumping off point to my next question, because there's two things you could take away, or two things you could begin to think about as you prepare, psychologically, economically for, a crisis, contingency, whatever that may be. And that's one, how do you get the economies to maintain resiliency in this kind of scenario? Because unlike COVID, I wouldn't call a Taiwan crisis telegraphed. It's not inevitable necessarily, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility that I think is on decision makers' minds far more than a global pandemic was back in 2019. So there's one question is, how can economies get themselves more resilient, to get themselves prepared so that when that crisis comes, if it comes, it's not necessarily quite that bad? The second one, because that's already a big enough question, the second one has to do with how can you use economics to possibly deter a crisis, but we'll set that one aside for later. So talk about economic resiliency a little bit. You talked about how this is a 10-year thing. What goes into those 10 years?
Well, I'm really glad you've teed it up that way, Paul, because that's exactly how I would frame it. The sorts of things that the governments have to do to optimize for resilience are not the sorts of things, in fact, are the opposite of the things that they would do to punish China. And if we're imagining a scenario where we've lost the supply of chips from Taiwan, that's a situation that's already extremely bad. And we have to ask ourselves, in that moment, would the politics allow us to take a very bad situation and make it even worse? And the answer I come to in the book is very likely not. And we have to think pragmatically about what that means for our options in dealing with China. So what could we do for resilience? Well, the first and most important thing is coordinated central bank intervention. We know from history at the beginnings of these kinds of episodes, capital moves like a tsunami from places that are risky into places that are perceived as safe. And that isn't always a rational reaction. It's a panic function because investors don't want to be the last one trapped in some risky, illiquid asset. What that would mean in practice is a flood of capital out of frontier markets, developing countries in Africa and Asia, Latin America, and into assets like Swiss francs, gold, and the US treasuries. And we know this from the outbreak of World War I, where investors sought safety in British pounds, even though the British were at war, because London was the financial center. Where else do you put the money? And it was only a few weeks later when the markets realized, this war might actually not be so great for the UK economy, that the gold started to flow the other way across the Atlantic to Washington. But in those initial weeks, the United States faced the risk that they would run out of gold, and they had to close the New York Stock Exchange for many months. So there would be an initial panic reaction, and then there might be a pendulum swing the other way. And you could see several of these pendulum swings happen very quickly, and it would be in response to what policymakers said and what they signaled that they were going to do. And this would put an enormous burden, above all, on the chairman of the Federal Reserve, now Kevin Warsh, and the Treasury Secretary, now Scott Bessent, to coordinate and communicate to markets what the United States was going to do. Would the United States give dollar liquidity to all countries, or just to countries that were taking its side in the confrontation with China? These are some fundamental questions. But what we do know, just because of the scale of what the shock would be, is everyone would be affected. And this would affect stocks and bonds and commodities and foreign exchange all at the same time. And there is a real risk that somewhere in the world, some big financial institution would blow up. And these things tend to have a cascading domino effect. Think about the UK. Because the UK's two largest financial institutions, Standard Chartered and HSBC, well, what do? How do they make their bread? The HSBC is the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank of China. They've been intermediating trade in and out of China for over 100 years. That's what they do. So there's some really difficult questions the United States would face about allied financial institutions and businesses that could become collateral damage if an economic confrontation with China accelerated. And that doesn't mean that economic confrontation with China is off the table. Just that if you want to keep the coalition together and your allies on board, you will have more variables to balance than just how do we max out the punishment of China.
So what about on the semiconductor side? You talked about all the semiconductors that come out of Taiwan. Well, you do see some countries, some places beginning to build their own fabs. You've got, various facilities in the United States. You've got Rapidus in Japan. Is that enough? If the countries can wean themselves off Taiwanese chips, wouldn't that blunt some of the potential impact?
Possibly, but we should not overestimate this for a few reasons. The first thing is that the semiconductor supply chain is just that. It's a supply chain. And Taiwan happens to be where the magic happens, where all of the ingredients are pulled together into the final stage of the process. But they require chemicals and advanced materials from Japan, EUV machines from the Netherlands, designs from the United States, memory from South Korea, a whole bunch of other components and materials and information. And then that is processed by these fabs. And the cutting edge continues to move with blazing speed. So it's very hard to catch up with Taiwan because it's a moving target. And they have this economy of scale that their competitors don't have. Rapidus is not going to be a direct competitor with TSMC. They specialize in making a very particular kind of industrial chip. TSMC is producing in Arizona. They're building a fab in Kumamoto as well. But these are going to be at least one generation behind, and they will require constant process support and a flow of people and other stuff from the mothership. So will these fabs actually be fully independently operating? I think it would be kind of crazy for Taiwan to give the US and Japan the crown jewels in that way. So I think we should expect that if Taiwan is blockaded or attacked, Taiwan is going to make their problem our problem, and we should be braced for it. Now, that's not to say we can't do something, and there's a whole lot of things that we can realistically stockpile. Oil is one, and Japan is a leader in this, but a range of critical inputs that could be hard to source if sea lanes are disrupted. Taiwan in particular needs to increase its energy stockpiles, but I don't think that there's going to be an easy solution for the loss of chips. Rather, I think that markets will adapt, and you may see some data centers dismantled and those chips used for other purposes, or recycling of, old chips used for different things, but it would fundamentally reshape the global economy for a decade or so. And the adaptation would be slower than oil because oil is ultimately geographically abundant, and chips are the hardest thing humanity has ever invented to make.
So to paraphrase Nixon's Treasury Secretary John Connally, there are chips, but they're your problem.
Something like that, Paul.
So let's turn to the other side of the coin. How could the United States or Japan or anyone use economic tools to deter China from initiating a crisis on this? You know, one of the lessons that I take from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, at least, is that, you know, the economic costs to Russia were real following the invasion. But if Putin wants to invade, he's going to invade. If he wants to absorb those costs, okay. Are we facing a similar situation with Xi Jinping and Taiwan? And if so, what could we do to get him to recalibrate his thinking here?
Well, we don't really know how Xi Jinping thinks. Take it from someone who spent pretty much my entire career psychoanalyzing the man. We don't have a lot of data points. This is not a guy who gives interviews and posts on Twitter his late night musings. He speaks in riddles. Everything that he says has been scripted and reviewed by 1,000 protocol experts, particularly with respect to Taiwan. Clearly, he is deterrable because he's been deterred so far. So there is some combination of costs and risks, which in his mind outweigh the possible benefit of seizing Taiwan through a crisis that humiliates the United States. And we just have to hope that we can keep that dream alive and that we can persuade him that he stands a reasonable chance of getting it for free or for a lower cost in the future. And we don't know how much the economy weighs into his thinking. The way that I would theorize it is, or think about it from first principles, is there's two ways that you can kill an economy. Fast, if you're really lucky, or slow. And fast is if you hit them with sanctions or some other combination of pressure tactics that just causes their financial system to implode on impact. Then maybe you can get them to cry uncle. I can't think of many examples in history where that has happened, but I don't know, the CCP is a brittle regime. It holds together its control over the people by force. Maybe it'll work this time. I do think that they're substantially vulnerable if the United States slams them with all-out dollar sanctions. Of course, that would take this financial crisis that we've just talked about and make it exponentially worse for everyone else, raising the question of how long it could be maintained. But if they could absorb that gut punch and not die but get back up, then, as you say, like with Putin, we're in an attritional fight that could last months or years. And in an attritional fight, it's really about political will. Which side is more able and willing to bear economic costs? It's not who suffers a greater hit to GDP. Now, I have some friends who've written a book that argues the opposite, that says we could potentially hit China with a GDP impact of 4 to 5 times what we would suffer ourselves. So the United States might suffer a 5% hit to GDP. China might suffer 25. To which I say, who cares? Because we're a democracy and they're not. And a 5% hit to GDP is global financial crisis bad. And we can't sustain that as a democratic polity that has to go to elections every 24 months. And we certainly can't sustain that if the effect on our regional allies and partners is closer to the China level of pain than the US level of pain. We need a different way of thinking about this problem, that it is not emphasizing maxing out on punishment, but is rather about crisis leadership and post-crisis reconstruction. Thinking about how we carry our coalition across this dangerous river, and then how we build something better on the other side. And I think that involves, first and foremost, reckoning with reality. The fact that we've spent 30 years outsourcing every supply chain you can think of to China, and it's trillions of dollars of capital investment, and hundreds or tens of millions of workers, 100 million workers in China producing stuff for export. And you're not just going to flick a switch and bring that back overnight. We're right now trying to decouple from China in a handful of critical things, and we're struggling even to do it for drones and medical devices. So the better way to think about it is how we could use a crisis over Taiwan as a trigger for what I call an avalanche decoupling, which would set in motion a process of breaking those supply chains in a more gradual and controlled way over time. And realistically, you wouldn't do it for all the supply chains. You do it for the critical things first, however you define them. I think that is a more realistic thing that you could do. And if you couple that with the central banks standing up the way they did in COVID, then we could present ourselves as the good guys. We could say, China did this terrible thing. They're trying to take the chips away. We're suffering this terrible economic shock because of that. We're making the situation better, not worse. But this is a crisis, and it reminds us we cannot be so dependent on an adversary. So we're going to break these dependencies as fast as we reasonably can, and we're going to do it together. I think that is the only plausible thing that we could do, other than just give Taiwan up, which I think would be a disaster. So as difficult as it is to contemplate some of these scenarios, the time that we should be having these conversations as allies and friends is actually right now.
So I'm glad you mentioned avalanche decoupling because I had it in my notes and I was going to ask you about that next, but you got there anyway. So good for you for anticipating my question. So I guess one of my final questions is, where is the U.S., whether that's the Trump administration or the Biden administration or the broader bureaucracy / deep state on these kinds of questions? Because what you're talking about depends quite a lot on coordination within the U.S. government, across global governments. And I don't want to get too political, but after watching the Trump's intervention in Iran, I'm really skeptical about at least the Trump administration's ability to finesse a situation like this. But I mean, you're the expert. You wrote the book. I'll let you speak to this. How is the United States government, both the political and the larger deep state, quote unquote, thinking about these things? And is this a needle they could thread? What's your confidence on that?
I can't presume to speak for the Trump administration. And I think that Donald Trump and his administration has been called many things, but coordinated is not one of them. So yes, the ideal type avalanche decoupling that I just described is, let's face it, unlikely to happen in practice. Because if the Taiwan crisis does emerge, it's going to be an star moment where we realize all of our vulnerabilities and the markets are in free fall and everyone is panicking. And many will call for surrender, for abandoning Taiwan to its fate, in spite of the catastrophic consequences that would have for the balance in the region, for world peace, for nuclear proliferation, for the rest. And maybe the United States would just throw in the towel. And this would be the great humiliation. This would be what Suez was to the British Empire, the rapid unraveling of everything that remains. And that would be the end of the American economic miracle that we have come to know in the last 100 years. It would be the beginning of a very different, very dangerous, very dark period of world history. That might happen. And then it's also possible that the United States just is a crazy cowboy and throws everything at China that it possibly can. And that there's a military confrontation as well. Even if China doesn't start it military, it quickly turns military and that things escalate. And who knows how that develops. And I think the Trump administration's strategy, based on its revealed thinking and its behavior, emphasizes those military preparations. Let me say no more than that. Look beneath the Trump-Xi Jinping détente, and you see a sprint on the part of the United States to build and deploy a range of capabilities to deter and defeat China on the battlefield. So maybe the U.S. is just thinking about this as a military thing. I think that would be a mistake. I think it would be very costly and very risky. But that is one approach. We will just ignore the economic aspects of this problem and show China that we could kick their butts militarily. But if you don't like option A and you don't like option B, then I'm sorry to tell you, there's only one way that you can prevent the Taiwan crisis from becoming an economic cataclysm for the world, but also break your critical dependencies on China. You either are going to break those critical dependencies fast, slow, or not at all. We saw on Liberation Day that it's basically impossible to do it fast. So if the choice is between slow and not at all, I vote slow. I vote predictable. I vote do it with allies. I vote align with the private sector to be predictable for businesses. That's how you'll save jobs. And you can pitch it to the people as a a new beginning, and not something that we chose, not something that we wanted, but something that history has forced upon us that we're going to make the best of. And all that I can do in this time of turbulence is go on podcasts like this one, go to Capitol Hill, go to allied capitals and talk to people and help them understand that there is another way, there is a third way between capitulation and economic Armageddon. But it's going to require a lot more conversations like this one and spreading the word that this is actually a scenario that could happen. It's something that affects all of us, that will affect all of us, and that the better prepared we are, the more able we will be to make sane, prudent decisions and work with allies in a time of crisis, and to have a steady pair of hands right when the temptation will be to panic. And that, I guess, is the vector of what I'm trying to do with the book. So thank you, Paul, for the opportunity.
Not at all. One final question. Coda, if you want to call it that. Where is Taiwan itself in all of this? Because, we kind of talk about them as an indirect object. China, United States, chips. But how, to the extent of your knowledge, how does Taiwan itself think about these kinds of questions? Is stuff like, the TSMC stranglehold on chips, is that part of a deliberate strategy to make them, their chips, but everyone's problem? A few quick thoughts on that before we finally wrap up.
Well, you've got 23 million people in Taiwan, and they've got more than one opinion. So in the interest of time, I'll talk a little bit about what I see as the current Taiwan government's approach, and then the alternative approach that's being put forward by the opposition, but these things change. The current government's approach emphasizes resilience and good relations with the United States. And the thinking is we matter to the United States not just because of the chips, but largely. That means we need to show the Americans we're a good partner. We need to allow TSMC to invest in the United States, work with the Americans on this. We will not give them all of the crown jewels, but we have to have a relationship of respect and trust. Meanwhile, we will get our military preparations in order in a way that we have not. We will get our society more focused on resilience and preparedness. A whole lot of work is being done on the ground right now, as we speak, in Taiwan, to make them a harder target against an invasion or blockade. And that doesn't solve the problem, but it's not nothing. And then you have an opposition party, the KMT, which is very divided internally. But their new leader has put forward a very different approach, which says essentially Taiwan doesn't have to choose between the United States and China. The world needs our chips. The world needs us for many reasons. We can participate in dialogue with both sides, and by holding the Americans a little bit at arm's length, can take down the temperature. I think there's a lot of skepticism in Washington about the prospects of this working, mainly because these are talking points that the Chinese Communist Party has been pushing for years that are now coming out of the mouths of Taiwanese. But we still don't know who the KMT will pick as their presidential candidate, and the election is 18 months away. All that we know is Taiwan is a democracy, and what it means to have a partner who's a democracy is they will make their own choices based on their own interests and perceptions of their interests, and then we'll have to work with them. And I think this is the time for Americans and Japanese and other friends of Taiwan to start paying closer attention to these debates that are happening, to understand that you may disagree with one of them, you may strongly believe that one of them is wrong, but these are both plausible readings of the facts. They both want the best. Both sides want the best for Taiwan. They want to maintain Taiwan's autonomy. They just have different theories of how to do it. And we need to be ready to work with either side. So I'd say watch this space. With an election coming, we're all going to be learning a whole lot more about Taiwanese politics than I think we have over the past few years.
Okay. Dr. Eyck Freymann, thank you so much for joining us. It's an important topic and it's an important book, and congratulations on completing this and getting the word out there, because I think this, as you say, is an essential conversation to have. So thanks for joining us. Keep up the good work, and we'll talk to you again in the future, I'm sure.
Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. On the topic of roads, given that we discussed the Royal Road of Ancient Persia on the last podcast, we'll turn to another royal road, this time in Mesoamerica. The Royal Road, or the Kapak Nyan, apologies for the pronunciation, of the Inca Empire, which stretched from modern Colombia in the north to modern Chile in the south. Like the Persian Royal Road, it included relay stations to accommodate the running messengers and to house the llamas, which served as pack animals, along with warehouses for storing goods for redistribution. As a work of engineering, it might be even more impressive than the Royal Road in Persia. Though built 2,000 years after its Persian counterpart, the Royal Road network of the Inca is impressive not just for its length, which itself is incredible at 25,000 miles, but also for the fact it was built across some of the highest mountains in the world, climbing 5,000 feet up into the Andes Mountains, and as such, it required the construction of retaining walls, bridges, water drainage systems, and more to accommodate the terrain. The couriers that worked these roads were as impressive as the ones Herodotus described in Persia, and could transmit spoken messages 150 miles in a day and carried goods like fruit, cocoa, and rare feathers from the Amazon jungles, beach sand from the Pacific coast to fill roads and squares across the Andes, gold and silver from modern Bolivia, and doing it all often in the thin air of the higher elevations. Its impact is still felt to this day, as a 2021 study by Sebastian Galliani, professor of economics at the University of Maryland, found that modern populations living within 20 kilometers of the Royal Roads of the Andes still experience higher wages, better nutrition, and higher education levels than populations living farther away. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.